Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Lind. I'm the Policy Director of the Economic Growth Program at the New America Foundation. On behalf of the Smart Globalization Initiative and the Economic Growth Program, I'd like to welcome you to today's event, which highlights the publication of what we consider an important new study, Manufacturing a Better Future for America, published by the Alliance for American Manufacturing, a nonprofit group that seeks to strengthen manufacturing in the United States. We have a truly rich and diverse panel here today. To introduce them, I'm going to invite Scott Paul, Executive Director of the Alliance for American Manufacturing and the publisher of Manufacturing a Better Future for America, to the podium. Scott?
Thank you, Michael, and thank you to the New America Foundation for hosting us today. First, let me just say a word about the Alliance. We are not a traditional Washington organization. We're a labor management partnership. It's a partnership of the Steelworkers Union, which is America's largest industrial union. They represent not only steelworkers, but workers in virtually every sector of the manufacturing economy. And on the other side, a group of businesses that are committed to domestic employment in the United States. We're not launched to be lobbying on Capitol Hill every day, but rather to provide a mid to long-term view of some of the issues that are critical to manufacturing, which allows us, I think, the space and the creativity to produce products like the book that Michael mentioned. I think today's discussion is particularly timely, coming on the heels of the U.S.-China strategic and economic dialogue, which concludes today, because it's impossible to de-link the future of manufacturing from our economic relationship with China. There's really no single more important connection that you can draw to the fate of manufacturing than to the imbalance that we see in our economic relationship with China today. And for his contribution on that topic and manufacturing more broadly, I also want to recognize Leo Hindry, who's the chairman of the Smart Globalization Initiative here at New America, for all the creative work that he and the team here are doing on this particularly challenging set of issues. At AAM, we have been privileged over the last 2 years to visit with literally tens of thousands of manufacturing workers across the country and hundreds of manufacturing firms to try to see what's going on firsthand in manufacturing. As you can imagine, the news is very grim. It's because for manufacturing, realistically, this recession began about a decade ago. It's simply been turbocharged for the last year and a half that we've seen the downturn in other parts of the economy as well. It's clear now more than ever that bold solutions are required to revitalize manufacturing, which is why we've sought to collect the wisdom of some of the smartest thinkers from around the nation on this topic. To that end, we've published this book. It features contributions from 10 scholars and experts. The book takes a comprehensive look at manufacturing and some of the issues that face it today. We look at international trade and globalization. We study an array of subsidies that are offered to our global economic competitors that our manufacturers are not privy to. We look at the consequences of offshoring of research and development and how critical that is for our country. We look at the shocking lack of support for investment in advanced manufacturing in this country. We look at the appalling state of skills and training programs in the United States. We look at the challengers for domestic manufacturers in globalized supply chains today, especially small and mid-sized enterprises who don't have global networks of their own. We look at the consequences of deindustrialization on communities, not only in places like Youngstown, but also in Sunbelt cities and California cities that have manufacturing but have lost it as well. And we look at the consequences of this demasculinization of manufacturing on our defense industrial base and the key challenges that will face our national security because of our declining ability to meet our own needs in terms of building the ships, the planes, and the parts that go into them that supply our troops. Even without reading this book, we all know that something's gone terribly wrong with the U.S. economy. But if we chalk up the blame simply to what's been happening on Wall Street and focus on regulating risky financial instruments, we're going to fall short. Because there are serious structural challenges in the economy today, and the health of manufacturing is at the heart of that. We have what I would call an absurd positive feedback loop right now between rising consumer debt, purchases of cheap Chinese imports, job loss in the United States and factory closures, a growing U.S. current account deficit because of this, and then burgeoning Chinese foreign currency reserves that amount to over $2 trillion right now that are reinvested in American debt that make this an endless cycle that we're not going to get out of unless we dramatically change course. Some of us warned this day would come. In fact, many people in this room. We knew that an economic strategy predicated on replacing wage growth with debt and credit to maintain a certain standard of living was doomed to fail. We knew that this nation could not replace manufacturing jobs and their multiplier effect, as well as their positive impact on the trade balance and wealth generation, with lower wage service and retail jobs. We knew that our national security would begin to suffer if we did not have a vibrant enough manufacturing base to resupply our troops and the armaments they need for the future. We knew that if our leaders viewed international trade as a foreign policy tool and a path to cheap imports rather than as an essential element for economic growth and domestic production, the consequences would be disastrous. These warnings came not only from labor leaders and domestic manufacturers and an insightful but small group of elected officials, they came also from very traditional economic quarters. Well before this new Great Recession began, Warren Buffett said, "Our trade deficit has greatly worsened to the point that our country's net worth, so to speak, is now being transferred abroad at an alarming rate. A perpetuation of this transfer will lead to major trouble." He was right. Martin Feldstein, former chairman of President Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors, said, "The present level of the current account deficit is enormous, it is unprecedented, and I believe it is unsustainable." Feldstein was right. The consequences have been dire. More than 50,000 manufacturing facilities have shut their door over the last decades. They weren't making buggy whips. They were manned by some of the most efficient workers in the world, as a matter of fact. Even today, we have large and growing trade deficits in areas like advanced technology products, and as New America has pointed out, in clean energy and green trade, we have a trade deficit already, even though these are supposed to be the industries of the future that will lead us to prosperity. So something is terribly wrong. The failure of our domestic and international trade policies to support manufacturing must be quickly reversed. We urgently need a national manufacturing strategy. We need an industrial policy in this country. The broad goal of such a strategy has already been outlined by President Obama in April. The president, appearing at a Group of 20 summit in London, said, "In some ways, the world has been accustomed to the United States being a voracious consumer market and the engine that drives a lot of growth worldwide. We're going to have to take into account a whole host of factors that can increase our savings rate and start dealing with our long-term fiscal position, as well as our current account deficits. Those are all issues that we have to deal with internally, which means that if there's going to be renewed growth, it can't just be the United States as the engine. Everyone's going to have to pick up the pace." I should add, by the way, that to the extent that all countries are participating in promoting growth, that also strengthens the arguments that we can make in our respective countries about the importance of world trade. The sense that this isn't a situation where each country is only exporting and never importing, but rather there's a balance in how we approach these issues. Our book, and I think the experts today, will argue that there can never be this balance unless we regrow the manufacturing base in this country and dramatically realter and restructure our trade policies. I'm going to introduce our panelists. The first is Richard Mccormick. He, in addition to being the publisher of Manufacturing and Technology News, as he has been since 1994, was the editor of our volume and wrote a chapter in it. He's the former editor of High Performance Computing and Communications Weekly, and he has been writing and observing manufacturing technology dating back to the 1980s. And Richard made an important contribution to this work. We also have with us Clyde Prestowitz, Jr., who is the president and founder of the Economic Strategy Institute, which was one of the first institutions in Washington to look at economic and trade issues from this perspective. He is the acclaimed author of 3 Billion New Capitalists, The Great Shift of Wealth and Power to the East. He served in a number of capacities in the Reagan administration dealing with commerce and trade. And Clyde contributed a terrific chapter on the evolution or devolution, I guess, of U.S. trade policy since the time of Alexander Hamilton for our volume. It's quite fascinating. And I think to provide a broader perspective and a response to this book, we have Leo Hendry, who is familiar to all of you, who is the chairman of the Smart Globalization Initiative at the New America Foundation. He's the managing partner of Intermedia Partners. He is the former CEO of AT&T Broadband and Yankee Entertainment and Sports Network, the former chairman and CEO of Global Center, Inc., and the president and CEO of Telecommunications, Inc., and he's the author of It Takes a CEO and the biggest game of all, the inside strategies, tactics, and temperaments that make great deal makers great, to provide a response to the study that we presented today. I'll now introduce Richard Mccormick for some comments that he has. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. I've been a journalist in Washington since 1983. I started on the staff of the Energy Daily, and I covered the Chernobyl meltdown in 1986, and that was a precursor to basically the meltdown of the USSR. So I covered the collapse of an empire in many respects, and I feel like I'm doing the same thing again here now. Back at that time, the story that I covered was how we responded to Japan, the rise of Japan, and we saw a concerted effort. We had the Council on Competitiveness created, the NCMS was created, the National Center for Manufacturing Sciences, Sematech was created, DARPA was activated, the national labs were activated. Brian Siebert at the national labs is very engaged in tech transfer as a big issue. In the 1990s, I covered basically the birth of the internet and the incredible digitization of the economy that came out of the investment that was made in the 80s to basically beat the Soviet Union. The story I covered in the 90s when I started manufacturing and technology news was lean, learning from the Keiretsu system and applying what we learned from the Japanese, agile, ISO 9000, Baldrige Quality Award, the Shingo Prize, the theory of constraints, best practices. This was the story of the 1990s for me as a journalist covering manufacturing. In the 1990s, I was wondering why I was located in Washington, D.C., because the story wasn't really Washington. It was basically how the country was revolutionizing every industrial process through the new use of this digital technology. We had the rise of workstations. We had AutoCAD, CATIA, Unigraphics being applied in the manufacturing environment. This is what I was covering. We had the rise of the relational databases that could integrate a global operation. So we had SAP, Oracle, and like Manugistics and J.D. Edwards. Those are great stories I was writing. And basically all that really changed after the dot-com bubble burst. And since then, and since, maybe you tie it to China's entry in the WTO, but since then, I have, as a journalist, I follow the story. And the story has been hard. And the story has been one of, loss, basically. And when I think of the last 8 years of covering this story, I think of some of the people I've spoken with in the manufacturing community. And to have grown men cry on the phone saying they're losing a business that's been operational since their grandfather or their dad. What that means to their community is absolutely a stunning thing to be on the phone or be in the presence of somebody who is seeing their whole livelihood collapse. Now, these people have been written off. It's like, okay, well, that's the benefits of free trade are such that somebody's going to have to lose, and that's, these are the people, unfortunately, they're going to have to lose. They've argued. I see there's some people here from the United States China Commission. You can't believe these people have come to Washington, D.C. They've met before all sorts of committees, all sorts of press conferences, the China Commission. They've told their story. And the story has really fallen on deaf ears. And then in recent months, things are starting to change a little bit because I think there's a realization that without manufacturing, you're not going to be a superpower. And for years, I'm telling you, there was this great rationalization for why we didn't need manufacturing. We're going to be a service economy. We're going to be a knowledge economy. And that really dictated the terms of the debate in Washington, D.C. We're going to consume our way out of this. We're going to give tax cuts to everybody. We're going to give everybody $156 billion last year, and we did that, and it's going to stimulate the economy. We have a war going on. That should stimulate the economy. We had all the tax cuts from the Bush administration. We have the stimulus. It's not generating economic wealth for Americans because all the stimulus is not going into production. And we continue to lose industries. And now the story, right now, the story is we have lost capability that is absolutely stunning, the capability we've lost. In the latest issue of my paper, I write about the printed circuit board industry. The printed circuit board industry, everybody acknowledges that is an essential high-tech industry. Without it, you don't have a modern economy. The U.S. printed circuit board industry went from $11 billion 4 years ago to $4 billion, and now it's about half that. That's noise. If you covered DARPA, if you covered technologies I did, the guys in DARPA will say, oh, that's noise. That's just not that big a deal because $2 billion out of a world global industry of $80 billion is basically noise. This is happening with industry after industry after industry. And the worry among manufacturers, the worry that they express to me because I talk to them, is that we're losing the knowledge of how to make things. We're losing the people. And when you lose the people, then you are going to have to build from scratch. And to build this economy back up, to make sure we pay off our debts, and we have plenty of them, and to make sure we can pay off the baby boomers who are going to be retiring here and the medical costs and this and that, everything that's required in a modern society, we better be starting to make products that the rest of the world needs, but that we can buy as well. We're a big market. We're 300 million Americans. We're a big market. That's a lot of shoes. That's a lot of iPods. That's a lot of computers. That's a big market. And if you look at industry after industry, we don't supply the market for mass consumption. There's a sense, if you travel, when you go to Flint, when you go to Saginaw, when you go to Youngstown, now when you go to Orlando and when you go to Vegas, the contagion is spreading. When you go to these places, there's a real sense this something's gone wrong here. And people and Americans understand that, but our policymakers haven't yet gotten it. And when you compare today the speeches, just at this China dialogue, when you compare the speeches from our political appointees to those that were given at the same dialogue by other administrations, you wouldn't know who gave the speech. They're identical. When you hear the current USTR give a speech, his speech, you wouldn't know the difference between his speech and the one Carla Hills gave or Portman gave. There's no difference. And now, in the latest issue of our paper, I interviewed Douglas Bartlett. He was quoted in the New York Times. He said he waited until he heard from the Obama administration to see if there was going to be a change in policy, and he didn't see one. So he closed his business, and he laid off 90 workers. His company was the oldest electronics manufacturing company in America, and he shut it down because he didn't see the hope that Obama had promised. And what he saw, in fact, was what he said to me, was I'm not going to be the sacrificial lamb because all this stimulus, I'm going to have to pay it off. Somebody's going to have to pay it off. I'm going to be a bill payer, and I'm not going to be a bill payer. That's right now, we're at this cusp of a change. Now it's the Obama economy. Obama didn't change. It's pretty much similar to what we've heard for the last 20 years, 30 years. So we've got our work cut out for us, and the work pretty much is now listening to the people who create wealth and create jobs and actually soliciting what do we have to do now to assure that there's investment in the United States to produce for our market and global markets. Whatever we have to do, whatever types of tax incentives, whatever types of R&D and investments that need to be made, they need to be made now. Thank you.
So I remember the first day I showed up in Washington to take up my position as counselor to the Secretary of Commerce in September 1981. And the Secretary of Commerce was Malcolm Baldrige. I walked into his office, Mac, here I am, what's my job? What do you want me to do? And Baldrige said, Clyde, your job is to reduce the U.S. trade deficit. You laugh. 1981, the U.S. trade deficit was $24 billion annually. And everybody said it was not supportable, unsustainable. We had to fix it, and so my job was to fix it. And so I asked Baldrige what would I get paid, and I forget exactly the number, but I remember it was a lot less than my wife and kids had become accustomed to. And I mentioned this to Baldrige, and he said not to worry, he was a businessman, he understood entrepreneurial spirit, he'd make me a deal. He'd pay me a bonus, 10% of the amount by which I reduced the trade deficit. 5 years later, I owed him $15 billion. Today, I guess I owe him $80 billion. This has been going on for a long time. John Young founded the Council on Competitiveness, I think it was 1985 or 84. And there was a definition of competitiveness at the founding of the Council, which talked about the ability to meet the test of international markets while providing a growing domestic economy without the need to borrow. The United States has not done that since 1981. The United States has not been competitive. It has increasingly achieved its growth by borrowing more and more, and hence the tremendous increase in both our domestic and our international debt over the last 25, 30 years. And so, as Richard said, and I've just underlined, this has been going on for a long time. And as Richard also said, it hasn't mattered whether the administration was Democratic or Republican, whether it was conservative or liberal. The policies in trade and in industry and what we might call globalization have been pretty much the same regardless of the administration or the party. And so I think we have to ask ourselves, why is that? What's going on? The recent passing of Robert McNamara, the former Secretary of Defense, I think provides us an insight. McNamara, throughout his life, after being Secretary of Defense, bore really what I think must have been a horrible burden for him, the knowledge that he had been horribly wrong about Vietnam, and that it had cost a tremendous price. And he will go down in history as a brilliant man who was horribly wrong. But he wasn't the only one, of course. Some of you are old enough to remember David Halberstam's great book, The Best and the Brightest, about Vietnam. And in the book, he underscored the point that the elite of the media and business and government and academia in our country bought into a doctrine, the Domino Theory. It was a doctrine that perceived communism as monolithic, as the Russians and the Chinese as being part of one great communist movement to achieve global dominance. And the theory was that if just one Southeast Asian country went communist, all of Asia would go communist and the world would go communist. It turned out to be a really simplistic, silly, flawed doctrine. It cost us 58,000 kids. And it was embraced by the whole leadership elite, the most brilliant minds, the graduates of Harvard Business School and Harvard Law School and Stanford and so forth, the best and the brightest. Well, ladies and gentlemen, a similar thing has been occurring in the area of globalization and international trade. Our elite has bought into a doctrine. We call it free trade. I think it would be better labeled unilateral free trade, or hybrid free trade, or Merco free trade, but we call it free trade. And we have applied or built our international economic institutions and policies around this notion that trade is always win-win. Indeed, that unilateral free trade, if your trading partner is so benighted as to put rocks in his harbor to prevent you from exporting to him, nevertheless, you should keep your markets open. This doctrine that trade is always win-win underlies everything that we have done in globalization. Now, the doctrine is not completely wrong. Trade sometimes is win-win. The great insight that David Ricardo had of comparative advantage, those of you who took Econ 101 remember Portuguese wine and British textiles, and that the trading of them, the specialization in what you do best and trading for the rest, was optimal both for the Portuguese and for the Brits and for total world production. That insight's important, and it's applicable in many instances of trade. It's particularly applicable when the trade is in products that do not have economies of scale. The assumption of that insight is that there are no economies of scale, constant returns to scale. It's applicable if there is no mobility of technology or capital across borders. The assumption of Ricardo was that British capital would not go to Portugal to create textile mills in Portugal. There would be no FDI. The assumption was that technology would not leap borders. And so if that is the context in which you're doing the trade, it works. But we all know that the world in which we live is one in which that kind of trade is restricted to a narrow section of our total trade. Most of our trade takes place in markets that are not perfectly competitive, that are oligopolistic with imperfect competition. All of our trade takes place in markets in which exchange rates are not fixed, but rather float or are managed. We have what we call dirty floats. All of our trade takes place in the context of markets in which technology and capital does move across borders. And in those circumstances, trade is not always win-win. Trade can be adversarial. It can be zero-sum. We have not recognized that. Particularly, we have not recognized that in terms of the role of the U.S. dollar. The role of the U.S. dollar as the world's money, both the currency of account and the currency of reserve, is one that puts the United States in a privileged position, but also in a dangerous position. It's a privileged position because we alone among the world's countries can borrow in our own currency. We alone among the world's countries can buy oil and other international commodities simply by printing dollars. Other countries have to produce something and earn dollars to buy oil. We just print them. And so this gives us a great deal more flexibility and leverage than any other country. But it also means that as long as the rest of the world will accept dollars, we can be irresponsible. Deficits don't matter to us. Trade deficits, current account deficits, budget deficits, doesn't matter. The war in Iraq, we're not paying for it. The cleanup of New Orleans, we're not paying for it. The Chinese are paying for that. We're borrowing from them. And as long as they keep taking the dollars, it's really not that costly to us. So it allows us to be irresponsible. It allows us to consume above our means, which of course we have been doing for quite some time and which of course underlies the crisis that we're in. it also allows the rest of the world to be irresponsible. It allows other countries, many of them in Asia, to manage their currencies, to intervene in currency markets, to manage the value of their currencies, to be undervalued in order to promote their exports, in order to foster their export-led growth strategies. And so really for the past 30 years, or really the past 50 years, the dollar has been pretty much systematically overvalued. Now, if you are on Wall Street, you like that. If you're the Secretary of the Treasury and you need to finance the U.S. deficit, you like that. It's easier to do that with a strong dollar. But if you're on Main Street, if you're these people that Richard is interviewing and talking about, producing real products with real people, this is anathema to you. This is a disaster for you. And this is where Main Street has been living for now quite some time. We have reached the point at which the dynamic has taken on a life of its own. Richard is quite right. If you look at the statements of the protagonists in these U.S.-China strategic dialogues, not only have they not been terribly different between administrations, but you notice that in this dialogue that we're having, that we had just a day or so ago, nobody talked about currency management. It's off the table because we are now in such a position that our leaders fear to discuss this in public for fear of spooking markets or for fear of antagonizing the Chinese, whom we need to buy our bonds. And the only way to reverse this, really, is to do something about our manufacturing base. If you look at our trade numbers, the deficit in goods is so overwhelming. There is absolutely no realistic possibility that we will ever have sufficient exports and services to overcome the deficit in goods. If we are ever to become competitive and to be able to grow our economy without borrowing, we're going to have to do it in manufacturing. And we can't do it in manufacturing unless we address the fact that the world is not a world of free trade. All these countries that belong to the World Trade Organization are not free traders. Many of them are mercantilists. And so, to paraphrase Lincoln, we live in a world that is half free trade, half free, and half mercantilist. And that world is not sustainable for the United States. Thank you.
I'm going to do this from here because I think we're all anxious to get to the Q&A. I know my colleagues on this dais today, as do you, perhaps enjoy that more even than our prepared remarks. It's a blessing and it's really a gift to follow Scott, who knows more about this technically than anybody, I think, in this country. Richard, whose passion for this issue speaks for itself, and Clyde, who brings such a remarkable sense of history. So let me just sort of wrap it in a way that may hopefully be provocative to the Q&A that we're anxious to elicit. The issue of the balance of trade is one that I could speak to as my colleagues have, but that's not what is driving my concern today. It is this massive income inequality that exists in the country today, the greatest since 1928 when we began to keep numbers of such sort, coupled with an effective unemployed base of 30 million American women and men. For almost 50 years, both parties have shied away from the true unemployment numbers. Sometimes it's the Republicans' turn to be in charge. Sometimes it's the Democrats. Neither like to address this issue, and so we hide from it. There are actually 30 million women and men who are effectively unemployed today, twice the official rate. And we will not solve the income inequality issue, nor will we be sensitive and respectful of those 30 million women and men if we do not have, as Scott has said, a national, all-of-government manufacturing and industrial policy. We are the only developed nation without one, and the absence of having one is glaring, and it's the underpins both the income inequality and the unemployment, it also masks our ability to actually address those two issues. I have a great deal of confidence in the our new president's perspectives on this issue. I have much less confidence in some of his senior advisors' sense of this issue. And I'm not in any sense trying to be disrespectful, but if we don't disabuse them of three premises that they are holding near and dear to their hearts, we will not have that policy and those outcomes that Scott has tried to lead us to. There are people in this administration who very wrong-headedly continue to believe passionately that a job is a job, whether that job is a manufacturing job, is a service job, no 6, 1, half dozen or another. Yet statistically and qualitatively, we know that a manufacturing job is a much more powerful driver of the economy than any service job, no matter how you wish to measure it. We've heard smart and informed and close advisors to the president say that whatever we have lost and will continue to lose in the manufacturing sector, we will make up for with the export of such wonderful services as legal services, management consulting, more movies, and more computer software. A fallacy of the greatest order. And if you don't like those two premises, the third premise is we don't pick winners, because up at Harvard we learned that economies should balance themselves, and we don't pick winners in this administration, notwithstanding the fact that every single other developed country picks winners every day. So with respect, I think there are some very specific actions that we can take now to put this country back on a track to double, and that should be our goal, to double the number of employees in America who are currently employed in manufacturing, and to double the level of GDP that flows from this sector. That should be a medium-term goal. Longer term, I obviously wish the number would be higher, but in the medium term, 2x on employment, 2x on impact on GDP. It's pretty simple. As others pick winners, we need to pick winners, and that winner right now needs to be the manufacturing industry. We know very, very well from Scott's book that infrastructure is the most immediate inducement to a protracted and sustained manufacturing sector. It also is the most instant solution to the job crisis we have in this country today. We need a Buy American policy that is respectful of our obligations under our international trade obligations. Again, we are the only significant developed country, including China, that does not have a buy domestic policy. 3 weeks ago, the United States Chamber of Commerce excoriated all of us who even had that thought in our minds. The irony was that was the very same week that China affirmed very publicly, very proudly, its own Buy China policy related to all of the green technologies that Richard spoke to. We need substantial, instant, immediate tax reform. We need to reduce the corporate income tax rate, and we need to reduce the payroll tax, and we need to replace those with a value-added tax. We also need to recapture offshore profits that have been allowed to linger away from our shores to the detriment of our workers. And something that Scott and I had the privilege not more than a week and a half ago of testifying in front of the Senate, and I've added a step since that point in time, and it saddens me that I needed to, which is we need substantial financial industry reform that focuses on small and medium-sized businesses. And the canary in the coal mine on this issue is the company CIT, which is being allowed to fail with no particular attention paid to it while we continue to exalt the likes of the Goldman Sachses of this country. CIT, a company not without fault in the run-up to this crisis, but a company that every day lends assistance to 950,000 small and medium-sized businesses, the #1 SBA lender for 9 years running, being allowed essentially to fail because it doesn't rise to the level of interest and appeal that Goldman and J.P. Morgan Chase and B of A and Citibank seem to have. The thing, and the perspective I bring to this discussion, and then I really do want to go to the Q&A, I've had the privilege, I grew up as a sheet metal journeyman, a merchant marine, worked my way through college in the shipyards, and had the privilege of transferring my career to the business side, not because of compensation opportunities. It just struck me that it fit my personality better. And it was a wonderfully magical time in that career paths were chosen because of relative stability and opportunity, and you could go into manufacturing just as comfortably as you went into business in the course I took. And we lived for 50 full years after the Second World War with most CEOs in this country committed to a vibrant middle class growing from the bottom up. We have a predicament today where 50 companies, roughly half of the business council of this country, dictate our policy on manufacturing, our absence of policies on exports, this favoritism that has moved towards the financial service industry and away from anything approaching a manufacturing policy. We have put at risk 90,000 of the remaining 282,000 manufacturers are gravely at risk of going out of business in the next couple of years. The thing that excites me about this dismal picture is that I believe there are more women and men, more CEOs, more business leaders, and frankly more political leaders who are committed to the issues we're speaking about today if we could just beat back the lobbyists and have, as Scott has tried to lead us to and others for a long time, a genuine, all-of-government, national manufacturing and industrial policy that mirrors those of our global competitors, the nations that Clyde spoke of so ably. So thank you for this privilege. The Smart Globalization Initiative is committed to this issue. Mike Lind, I wished he had had more time to speak himself. I hope he does in the Q of A. Cheryl Sweninger, Mike Lind, Sam Sheridan in the back, they do all the heavy lifting on this issue for me, and I just have the privilege of sitting up here from time to time. So thank you for joining us. Thanks again, Mike, to you and New America, Steve Cole, Steve Clemens, and all of your colleagues. And again, I think we'd love to do some Q&A from you now, in plenty of time left to do a lot of it. So if you could introduce yourself, it would be appreciated. We're being videotaped in some fashion or another, I think webcast. So it'd be, if you'd give us the courtesy of who you are, and if you would direct a question or not to the group, it'd be great. Thanks very much. Yes, ma'am. We're going to wait just
we need
to
wait for the microphone.
One
please.
second, we'll run a mic up. Oh, I'm sorry. Sir, why don't we do you, because you have a mic, and ma'am, I'll take you right after that. I'm sorry, sir.
My name is Napoleon Cooper. I'm from the nonprofit sector. It seems to me that expecting innovation from Congress or the Trade Representative Office is something of a fool's errand. Blaming President Obama after 6 months isn't much more. We have a economy unique, and we have three pieces to it: government, nonprofit, for-profit. Looking at manufacturing from a reverse engineering point of view, a good end result would be saturating less developed country markets with American manufactured goods. We have provisions in our tax code, special rule inventory, for contributions that allows recovery of costs and half of appreciation. Manufacturers, the associations, the leaders, the manufacturers themselves, to my way of thinking, with reverse engineering in mind, should be focused more on how do we use the systems and resources in law, tax, our for-profit ambitions to get where we want to be as capitalists. That's the basic point. Why don't we reverse engineer from where we want to be? How do we use what we have to get there?
Great, thank you. Why don't you take that, Scott?
Others may have a perspective on this. I appreciate the question. If self-help was the answer, we would have solved it already. I mean, American manufacturers, our workers are the most productive in the world. We still produce an incredible amount of innovation in this country. But what we failed to do is produce the product here. And as we've pointed out, this is across every sector. I mean, and when you look at it, we're talking about, automobiles, we're talking about chemicals, we're talking about durable goods, consumer goods, we're talking about advanced technology products across the board, except for when we're talking about basic commodities and scrap. We get devastated. And it is the combination of tax and trade and skills and training and other sort of policies that are the greatest impediment to unleashing the innovation and the productive power of this sector of the American economy. There is no question about it. And I think that if you reverse engineer the words of our leaders in Washington dating back over the last 20 years, you can see that there is a deliberate bias towards trying to move towards this mythical knowledge economy or a retail, healthcare, service, and education economy that cannot exist without a foundation. So I respect the point of view that you have, but I'm here to tell you that over the last 20 years, manufacturers have tried to work within the confines to make this work. They have cut to the bone. They've cut beyond the bone. And it is impossible, given the structure that's in place, to compete. So the question becomes, do we want to give up altogether, or do we want to try to make it work? And I think the consensus view of us is that we have to make this work. We have no other choice.
Well, we pass that mic forward. Mike, why don't you offer some comment on that, if you would?
Well, I think Scott put his finger on it. Up until the Great Depression, all right-thinking people, whether they were respectable liberals, respectable conservatives, believed that you had to have the gold standard, and you simply deflated your prices. You had mass unemployment, and that was the sensible, prudent, fiscally responsible thing to do. Now, all economists since the Great Depression agree that this was completely insane, and yet it was believed by reasonable people. So when you ask yourself, what is the same kind of insane idea that most thoughtful, prudent, respectable, educated people believe today? Even more than the free trade, I think it's this idea that manufacturing is a primitive phase of economic development that advanced societies outgrow. That you go from, I suppose, hunter-gatherer to farming, to manufacturing, and then you go to the knowledge economy. This is believed by liberals like Robert Reich. This idea that we will all be symbolic analysts and we will write software and then sell it to the Asian manufacturing countries. It's believed by the right, the libertarians. So what we're trying to do here at New America in alliance with the Alliance for American Manufacturing and others is to make the case that that basic idea is wrong. A high-tech society is not one where you cease to manufacture, in the same way it's not one where you cease to engage in resource extraction or you cease to engage in agriculture. You continue to be an industrial society, but you add IT. You have high-tech manufacturing. You have high-tech agriculture. You have high-tech mining. And even if these employ only a minority of workers in your society, the production-related services they generate are far more important to your economy than those associated with pure consumption and the logistical transportation of goods from the Port of L.A. to Walmart.
Ma'am?
I'm Mitzi Wertheim. I work for the Naval Postgraduate School, and I run an energy conversation here. I'm struck by the importance of learning how to tell a very complex story. I've been trying to tell the energy environment story for the last 5 years so John Q. Public could get it. I was sitting here listening to you fellows talk saying, is John Q. Public going to understand all these minute details? The challenge for me is to try to figure out what's the essence of the story, where are the weaknesses, and what are the things actually that need to be done in detail, which is really hard. If there are things that need to be changed in the laws, it would be nice for us to know which are the ones we ought to be screaming about. I worked on manufacturing back in 1982 at IBM when all this stuff was starting to go through. I mean, it was fascinating. And all the discussion was on a service economy, and I kept saying, this is nuts. So it's very hard to be against the tide. It's just very hard to do that, except we all need to start pointing out being against the tide may, in fact, have some very good ideas. The academic community gets so caught up, they get tenure by saying this is the answer, and then their answer they carry forward for the next 50 years, and getting them to recognize the world has changed is really tough. When they start making money on Wall Street and they figured out a way to do it, why should they give it up? I mean, this is a really tough story to tell, and if you don't put it in, I always talk about it in terms of children's books for adults. Because if you don't get it down to the essence, the rest of us get lost in the minutia.
Let me just try to answer that quickly, if I might. I think, from my vantage point, the essence is reemployment of a substantial percentage of those 30 million women and men who are unemployed. Let me finish if I can. What I think that we can prove to anybody in California, Ohio, and New York that number cannot be achieved, that reemployment number, absent the manufacturing policy. To put a specific on it, we've all watched the state of California get crushed, largest deficit in the history of the union at the state level. The Milken Institute did a piece just the other day that proved that if California had simply held its manufacturing percentage that it had 10 years ago, it would have not had a budget crisis this cycle. And so, politics aside, I need employment for my family, and everybody in this room needs it for his or her family. I think that is, in large part, the solution. And I think the foolishness of arguing that a service job on average is as good as a manufacturing job on average is now pretty apparent to most Americans, and it's why there's some shakiness to the confidence in the economy numbers that have happened just since the election in November.
Can I say something, though?
Sure.
Because it's my job to tell the story. And you say it's a tough story to tell, but people understand intuitively when they're in places that are losing factories. They know the story. It's in their family. It's in their relations. So the story has not been told very well. And Fritz Holling says this a lot. The newspapers are supported by retailers. The retailers, importers. The importers say, yeah, don't write those stories because, we're a consumer society. And guess what? The newspapers are going out of business. They haven't told the story. The newspapers haven't kept in touch with their readers. And their readers know that there's something wrong. And it hasn't been really described in the press very well. And one other thing, we all have anecdotes. Everyone has anecdotes. And I have plenty. But I come across so many people who shop, and they go into Walmart. They know where things are made. They know there's something wrong. And the story is not that hard. And right now there's a receptive audience for the story. Now, the issue is how to deal with it, and this is very complex. This becomes very complex. It's the whole issue of globalization, and what do you do? So we're right at that point now. And when we have Jeffrey Immelt coming out, and we have Ford Motor coming out, say we need to address this for the first time, we have an inflection point here. So hopefully our government, and this is to the point that was raised here, reverse engineering, hopefully our government is responsive to these people and will listen to them and will start asking. I covered best practices in the 1990s. And we'll start asking, why are all these plants being built? Why are they moving? What is the enticement to move them? Just ask the question. Get the CEOs in front of your committee and ask them why you moved all of your Levi's plants out of the United States. Just ask them what the inducements were. We want to know. Subpoena it if you have to. But find out why we've lost our industrial base and start asking companies for their suggestions.
Next question.
Good afternoon, gentlemen on the panel. I'm actually a D.C. native. I went to prep school here, but I run a factory in Fenton, Michigan, about 12 minutes from Flint. And I'm probably one of the few people in the room, perhaps, that have been in and out of Bishop Airport 20, 25 times a year. I'm based in Chicago. And perhaps our story is, it's probably quite typical. I did two quick questions. One is, and maybe a little bit of a broader perspective. I've been in and out of Washington maybe 10 times in the past 6 months. We've been focused on getting the Defense Procurement Act, Section 3, it's an obscure section, to get the Office of Management and Budget to raise their ceiling from $100 million to $1 billion just in loan guarantees for small and medium-sized businesses. The way the scoring works in Washington, the credits, because these are loan guarantees, it would actually provide $4 to $5 billion of financing for small and medium-sized businesses that support the defense industrial base. The Senate had hearings about this on May 13th. I can tell you that both Senator Brown and Senator Dodd are very supportive. We've been with all the lobbyists. We've been to probably 30 congressional delegations, and everyone is saying it's very important. We want to do it, but there's no will to do it. So that's sort of a cautionary, instructive tale, and I'd be curious about your reaction. And I think a quick follow-up question, because I know there are a lot of people who want to ask questions here, this is a very complex story. I can tell you that at our factory, we make the world's largest metal forming automation equipment that moves 50 to 80 ton dies for the production of aerospace parts, auto parts, appliance parts. Our labor is down 85%. Our revenue per employee is up 400%. We're doing what we can to survive. I think we will survive, but we are completely typical of all of our neighbors. So the question is, how do you get the story out in an effective manner whereby government policy and private industrial inducements are working in the same way?
Clyde, why don't you take that one with a particular answer on access to credit for as part of a finance reform that's going underway?
Well, I'm not a credit expert. I mean, what the gentleman says about being able to leverage the credit is terribly important. And I'm not familiar with this particular situation, and I'm not sure why it's not moving. But in a way, I am. And let me start really by commenting on the previous question. I think actually that the public understands this. The story is not that hard to tell, and Richard and other people have been telling it, and the public gets it. The problem is our leadership elite. And anybody who's studied Econ 101 has been indoctrinated with a particular doctrine about trade and globalization. Anybody who's got a PhD in economics in an American university in the last 50 years has been taught this particular doctrine. All the people who write about this, the columnists, the Washington Post, the New York Times, none of them have a columnist who deviates from orthodoxy. So the problem is the dead hand of orthodoxy here, and it's very much as Mike said about the gold standard, or as I tried to say about the domino theory. Somehow that orthodoxy has to be broken, and I've been trying to break it for a long time, as many of you know, and so have others of us here, and I'm hoping that the crisis actually gives us more of an opportunity to kind of break that. I think that the problem he mentions is really symptomatic of that. I go around to the lobbyists and to the Congress and everybody too, and you talk to individual officials or individual congressmen, and they say, yep, right, good idea, yep, we got to do it. But it doesn't really happen because the mindset is not there. The mindset that we need to have an industrial base, the mindset that manufacturing is important, the mindset that we need to be competitive, it's not there. If you go to well, you all know this. I mean, go to Israel, go to China, go to Ireland, go to Singapore. and officials there and commentators and analysts there are thinking all the time about what's the structure of our economy going to be? How are we going to compete if we're Singapore? How are we going to compete with the Chinese and the Indians 10 years from now? People in the U.S. don't think that way, and I think this is really a mindset issue.
Next question.
Thank you. My name is Gilbert Kaplan. I'm an international trade lawyer here in Washington, and I represent a lot of semiconductor companies, pipe companies, paper companies, so I've been struggling with these issues for a long time. I was driving around Washington a couple of weeks ago, and I came to the Delacarlia Parkway off MacArthur Boulevard. There's a nice, very big sign there that says, "Another project from the American Recovery Act, replacing the streetlights on Delacarlia Parkway." And I asked myself, why are we replacing streetlights rather than putting money into manufacturing? Because we've all been working on manufacturing. Everyone here would find that to be an easy call. Why have we gotten into this mess? And I've been in the government. Many of you have been in the government who are in this room. And I think the answer is that no one is really standing up for manufacturing in these discussions. I would like to have had someone in the cabinet who would have leaned over to President Obama and said, well, we're spending $1 trillion. This is a good time to revive manufacturing, not to do a lot of WPA projects, which will give someone a job for 3 weeks, but not more. So I've written a couple of op-ed pieces. I think we need a Secretary of Manufacturing in this country who will be in the cabinet and who will be charged with standing up for manufacturing on a regular daily basis. Because if you go into the interagency meetings, which I've been in, and others of you have, no one is doing that. There's the trade representative. His job is to make deals. And many of these deals, I think we would say, are not necessarily focused on helping manufacturing. They're focused on building the economy, in effect, in a more broad-based way. But we need someone who's going to say, well, we've got to focus on the manufacturing impact of this particular trade agreement. Go to the Secretary of Commerce. The biggest thing in commerce is NOAA, which is basically the Weather Bureau. So it's not a manufacturing responsibility. We need someone who will work on integrating trade, technology, tax, labor, financial incentives, and investment for manufacturing. That's why I think we do need a Secretary of Manufacturing. We have a Secretary of Energy, we have a Secretary of Agriculture, and I would argue those sectors have been taken care of a little bit more. The most profitable company in the world is Exxon, because there's somebody standing up for those issues. So I'd just be curious as to your reaction to creating a Secretary of Manufacturing to stand up for these issues.
I think Exxon's been taking care of itself. I actually took a poll while we sat here. The vote was 5-0 for your idea. So rather than answer it, I will tell you, the five of us, you got our vote. So let me do one more question. I want to stay kind of on a list schedule here. And then I'm going to do two up front here after this gentleman.
Sir, this will be really quick. Major Gabe Grease, Defense Technology Security Administration. Two-part question. How do we choose a winner and create a product with a price point that's competitive without creating a backlash around the world? And second part would be, what industries would you choose winners in?
I think let me try to answer that quickly, and then why don't we do two questions up here after that. Major, I think the answer when you dig down into the numbers is that most of the trade imbalance that Clyde was referring to is not based on wage differential. That's a pretty old saw that doesn't stand up. Our inability to compete is a function of illegal subsidy, massive currency manipulation, poor environmental practice, and quite poor labor practices in some jurisdictions. And as we pick winners, I think the first measure would be to watch where others are picking winners and try to emulate that. Those industries of ours that are under attack would be the ones that many of us, I think, would pay most attention to. I think you will hear all five of us say that the difference between fair free trade and free trade is a chasm right now. None of us can get away with being protectionist. That will, in fact, elicit the backlash that you speak about. But the patent unfairness around subsidy and currency manipulation, especially, and environmental practices, third, is palpable and it's provable. And as you listen to the five of us argue for the kind of trade agreements that we would like to see, those would be the attention. I have a particular bias against multilateral trade agreements. I think one-size-fits-all trade agreements is passé. I think you default to least common denominator. I'm not a fan of the Doha round for that reason. I think bilateral allows you to put forward those principles more constructively and more precisely than anything you might do multilaterally. I think we're going to do this gentleman, then front row. And then I'll come back to you. No, so, yeah, sir, please.
Sorry. My name is Louis Soares. I'm with the Center for American Progress. Just really want to focus a little bit on small and medium-sized manufacturers. So for almost 15 years, I ran an MEP program and a Procurement Technical Assistance Center. And one of the things, some of the questions I have that I pose to the group, one, not all manufacturers are created equal. Some are more effective than others at competing globally. I know this is within a larger context of federal policy broadly, but I saw many companies who were less efficient than their peers, but because of the relationships they had with the Defense Department or with local elected officials, they were able to hold on to that market. And eventually, I saw them close, so they were losing. So you have, even at that level, you have the way that people are using federal programs. And legislators know this. They know how they're being used by folks to do this. And so when then those same folks come back to them and say, well, you know, we're the most productive, we're this, we're that. One, two, the metrics around those two programs. The multipliers that we use to calculate job creation around the MEP and the PTAC are not really directly related to whether or not those programs actually cause the change in those companies. And so this gives coverage to federal agencies and to the Congress around, hey, we're funding this, but the idea that there's a measurable return on investment that's real in creating that manufacturing base, especially among small and mid-sized manufacturers, I would argue is exaggerated. And just your thoughts on those two.
Well, I've covered the MEP since it was created by their hauling centers now, and I think it was '87. But if they were dependent on the government, that's not a great market, I don't think. And when you see a plant close, it's like one of these maelstroms. Suddenly you get this whirlpool. Everything kind of disappears into the whirlpool. Well, you see a plant close, and all those small manufacturers just go disappearing down that hole. Not only them, but restaurants and everybody else in the community. I think the key is you have to create an environment where there's investment in that plant and equipment in the United States, and then the suppliers will supply to that commercial market. If they're dependent on politics or the DOD, that's not a good economy. It's not a healthy economy. And, MEP, PTAC, I think, how big is that program? $13 million a year or something? If we spend $150 million on abstinence education, I mean, MEP is struggling along at $120 million a year. I'm telling you, that's not even a drop in the bucket, really. So maybe they don't work, maybe they're not very good, but that's all we got. So.
Thank you for most informative discussion today. I want to end this. My name is Bill Frymore with Stewart & Stewart on an optimistic note by asking you to quickly comment on two major events in the news of the past year that give me great reason for optimism for the future of manufacturing. The first is the salvation of the U.S. auto industry appears to be occurring. 1 out of 10 American jobs, probably won't be that many in the future, but we'll have a smaller industry that will survive, and GM, Chrysler, etc., will survive. What are the lessons from this in terms of industrial policy? It's rather big camel's nose under the tent, but it is a camel's nose under the tent with regard to industrial policy with this administration. How can we get them to take the next steps? And I think part of the problem they've had with this is they haven't sold it one iota. They've run away from it. And the public doesn't, they understand the major problem in manufacturing. They understand the problems in the auto industry. But they're like, it should be market-oriented. This government bailout's crazy. Administration, I don't think, has sold it. The second reason for optimism that you alluded to earlier amongst the elites is the fact that people like Jeff Immelt are talking our language. They're not taking our actions yet, but they're talking our language. And he wants, as you know, 20% of the U.S. workforce to be engaged in manufacturing. He's putting his money where his mouth is by putting research and development in Michigan and a few other things. Briefly comment on those two trends. Are they indeed reason for optimism, and is Immelt coming our way?
Well, I can't speak about Mr. Immelt, but I do think there is some moderate grounds for optimism. If you look at the rhetoric of this administration, they say China has to switch from an export-oriented to a demand-oriented economy. We have to manufacture more. I think the policies fall far short of the rhetoric, but it's a different rhetoric than we got in the Clinton administration, for example, or the Bush administration. So, now the question is, will the policies match the language, or will this simply turn out to be empty rhetoric? Would you like?
I'm going to add one quick comment, and I know Scott wants to speak to this. I think the reason the auto recovery worked so well is Ron Bloom largely steered it. And Ron Bloom, for those of you who don't know, came out of the steelworkers. He spoke more cogently and capably about the need for a manufacturing policy before a lot of us got, not a lot of us, we were all engaged for a long time, but he's pretty damn good at it. And I think he brought a sense of manufacturing policy to that initiative, not strategy, but policy. And this is an issue that Scott and I have gone back and forth. Are what we talking about here, is it a strategy or is it a policy? And we think, Scott and I and Ron, I think, would say it's a policy. And when you have a policy, then you save CIT if it needs saving because it does certain things. You approach GM and Chrysler as he tried to drive the administration because it would fit under his sense of policy. Strategy is transient, but policy sustains.
Just 30 seconds, and I thought it was a good question, Bill. I think that the task of the auto rescue is a different one than having a prospective industrial policy. This was more triage. And so it was a task that I think they performed probably as well as they could. I would have done it differently, but we'll have the result that we get. But it's a far different task than trying to incubate and grow production in other sectors. And so I think there needs to be that transition. And I think one of the greatest impediments to that, and we saw this even during this triage, is the Wall Street mentality that too many people still have. It's about what is going to please the markets rather than about what is the right thing for employment and for long-term economic growth. And we need to overcome that obstacle.
This gentleman, and then Pat Malloy, and then we're going to have to be finished on questions. I'm sorry.
James Ross, Center for International Relations. I have not a lot of comments, but just two quick questions. I was wondering, the current account figure is one of the biggest and most prominent figures that's displayed when talking about trade relations with other countries. And I was wondering why there's not more nuance in it, because the current account figure can be exports minus imports, but it could also be foreign direct investment. So when Hyundai invests $1 billion in Alabama for a manufacturing plant, that counts against our current account deficits. So I was wondering why there's not more nuance on that. And secondly, industrial policy, how do we avoid falling into the classic example of South Korea, where they pick large businesses and manufacturers, while most jobs created in the United States are small and medium-sized businesses?
Okay, let me take it correct. First of all, the current account deficit, I'm not sure what you mean by more nuance, but I mean there's a specific definition for it. It's imports and exports of goods and services, and it also involves international transfers. And I mean, in the U.S. current account, we have a huge negative in trading goods. We have a moderate surplus in trade and services. and our international transfers are typically negative because of our aid programs and our military expenditures abroad and so forth. And then so we're typically in deficit on the current account, and we finance that by importing capital. That Hyundai plant that went wherever it went is imported capital, and so in a sense that's financing our deficit. Now, in that case, foreign direct investment, which is actually producing something in the U.S., is a nice way to finance. More frequently, the way we're financing is by simply selling treasuries, increasingly short-term treasuries, or by selling existing assets in the U.S., which doesn't really add to the U.S. productive base. But let me get to your question about industrial policy, and maybe I can use this to make another comment. That we've talked about we need an industrial policy here to stimulate manufacturing. I think that there are really two major things that we absolutely must do, that if we don't do them, it doesn't matter what policies we have, and if we do them, the rest of it would be much easier. And I want to emphasize that we're talking manufacturing here, but we need to be cognizant that the dynamics of the global economy right now are such as to all the incentives in the global economy right now are to move anything that's tradable out of the U.S., whether it's manufacturing or a service or or R&D. R&D is moving out of the U.S., services are moving out of the U.S., as well as manufacturing. The incentives are to move anything tradable out of the U.S. And the two key incentives here are the dollar. The dollar is managed to be overvalued. It's managed to be overvalued by China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and some other countries. And it's also managed to be overvalued by the U.S. Treasury. And the overvaluation of the dollar makes it easy to sell treasuries, but it makes it hard to maintain tradable production or tradable provision of services or even R&D in the U.S. And the second thing is financial investment incentives. Intel recently announced two major factories, one in Israel, one in China. These are $5-6 billion operations. Each of them will employ 3,000-4,000 people. Those jobs pay $100,000 a year. The interesting thing is that if you look at this in terms of orthodox neoclassical economics and ask yourself, in what products does the United States have a comparative advantage? Well, Intel makes 85% of the world's microprocessors, and it makes 80% of them in New Mexico. So any economist will tell you that the United States has a comparative advantage in microprocessors. The logic, therefore, is that the U.S. should be making the microprocessors and exporting them to pay for the stuff that we import from the rest of the world. Why, therefore, is Intel putting this plant in India, in China, or Israel? New Mexico is the low-cost, high-quality, productive place to make microprocessors. Why China or Israel? And the answer is very simple. Because the Israelis and the Chinese are putting up about half of the capital cost of the factory and providing tax holidays for, I don't know how long, but for some time. And the United States does not match that. Now, you don't have to pick winners and losers. You don't have to have complex analysis of gains and loss. Here's an industry in which the United States is dominant, which we are the winner. And that industry is being leached out of the U.S., and I don't even blame the foreigners. If I were the foreign countries, I would be doing precisely what they're doing. I would do what China is doing. I would provide incentives, and I would manage my currency. The United States is not responding.
The last question, and then we'll have to end this. I apologize.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I salute the panel, and your testimony has not fallen on deaf ears. I think Clyde and Richard both testified before the China Commission, as has Gil Kaplan, who talked about the Secretary of Manufacturing. What I note is China does have a national strategy, a grand strategy, to strengthen its comprehensive national power, and part of that strategy is to incentivize our corporations to move our wealth-producing capacity from here to there. And they offer incentives, including an underpriced currency. What I wanted to ask here, though, is We had a testimony hearing in Rochester this past week, and we had a professor from the Harvard Business School, Willie Shai, who talked about this outsourcing, and that it's reached the stage now where everybody says, well, we're going to innovate new products, and that's going to be our salvation. And he said, because our industrial base and what he called the commons of industry is being outsourced, we are now losing our ability to innovate in this country. And the innovation is going to be taking place in these other countries. And if that happens, we are really in a mess. But I wanted to see if this group shared any of those concerns.
When you say that, there was a study that was done by the PCAST, the OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy. It was headed by George Scalise. It's still on their website. They didn't post the study, though. It was during the Bush administration. And he, in that study, wrote about you cannot decouple manufacturing from R&D and innovation. And if you do, if you take the manufacturing out of America, the R&D and innovation is going to follow. And that was a PCAST report that was done 6 years ago or 5 years ago. It's the first time I'd seen the term decoupling. You cannot decouple your manufacturing from your R&D. You need both. You need one to do the other. The Bush administration didn't put out a press release. They didn't post the report on the internet. It took a year before they posted that. But it's still there, and it's still true. And, people in the manufacturing community thoroughly understand that concept. You lose your manufacturing, you lose your R&D and your innovative capability.
Thank you all very much. It's a real privilege. Thanks.